Welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're once again facing dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, fighting our way to the castle beyond the Goblin City in order to take a look at Jim Henson's Labyrinth, the board game. Released in 2016 by River Horse, we're having a look at the miniature playing pieces in this game. I've already painted up Ludo, and today we're going for the Goblin King himself, Jareth.
Aren't you? You're the Goblin King.
We're going to be looking at the colours I've used, the order I've applied those layers, and what techniques I've used in order to paint up Jareth. So without further ado, let's get on with it.
You have 13 hours in which to solve the labyrinth before your baby brother becomes one of us forever.
First of all, I'm applying a white primer as a base. This is just a spray primer from Halford's Automotive Car Paint, and I'm applying a white primer because it's easier to paint the white sleeves that Jareth has over the top of white instead of over the top of a darker colour. I'm then going to take a slightly blunted hobby knife and use that to scrape down the seam lines around where he has come out of the two-part mould. You don't want these seam lines, this extra plastic on here, because given the small scale of this miniature, that's going to be really obvious. So I'm just scraping that off carefully in order to tidy it up a bit. So the first thing to note is that Jareth goes through an awful lot of costume changes in this movie. This particular costume that this miniature is depicted wearing is the one from the throne room.
Oh, he's a lively little chap. I think I'll call him Jareth. He's got my eyes.
This is the outfit that he wears when he's doing the Dance Magic Dance song, but without this cape. He takes it off before he does the music. What we're going to start with though is this white on the shirt. So we've got the arms and the collars of the shirt, which I'm going to do them first because I find that white is a really tricky colour to work with, and it doesn't go over the top of other colours particularly well. So I'm going to try and just do those first and then work all the rest of the colours around it very carefully. And the first thing to say with painting things white is don't ever use straight white. This is a much kind of grayer, slightly beigeier, but definitely darker colour than white. So don't just paint things straight white. Having said that, I'm going to use this straight white. Now I'm just going to use this as a base coat, and then I'm going to tint this with kind of a glaze over the top, but basically I'm going to put a thinner wash of a darker colour over the top of it to grade it down to something a bit darker rather than this pure white. But I am going to start with pure white. And yes, I am painting white over the top of white, which does seem a bit superfluous, but the base coat does not go into all of these where I've sprayed it with primer. It doesn't go into all of the gaps. So I'm just going to go over this, make sure the whole thing has got a nice even coat of white on there, particularly where I've scraped away some of those mould lines. I'm going to do that all over, not caring about where that goes because it's already white, and we're going to paint over the top of anything else later on. For the base colour of his leggings here, I'm going to mix up a colour which is mainly grey here, but is also going to have a touch of blue to it to get this kind of slightly blue-grey colour here. And then once that's down and applied to the leggings, then I'll be able to use a darker, straighter grey colour in order to paint in these kind of cracks or kind of like reptile print scales on here. And I'm just going to use that on the leggings and apply that and paint that all over, not really worrying about the boots too much because they're a much darker colour, so that'll go over the top easily, but I'm going to paint that all the way up, and we're going to get that applied to everything on there. With the grey dry here, I then applied some black to the boots, the vest and the gloves here. I've just used this black to do that, and I've just made sure that when I met the leggings or the white sleeves of the shirt or the ruffles, that I was very neat around those areas, but everything else with the black where it overlaps, say, the back or the inside rather of the cloak, it's a little bit messy, and that's okay because that's going to get painted over later. It's only those edges of that colour that I've already done before that need to be neat. I've now started his cape, and for this I've gone for a very dark brown, this one here in fact, and this is just going to be the base coat for this cape because I want it to be quite a dark bronzy kind of colour in order to match this reference photograph. I'm now going to paint the inside of the cloak here, and for this you can see it's a very, very dark blue but with very sparkly highlights on it. So for this I'm going to use this very dark blue here, this ultramarine, in order to lay down a base coat on there, and then once that's dry I'm going to use this metallic blue here in order to go over that. With most of my base colours down, I'm now going to go in and use some Kislev flesh in order to put in the skin tones on the face, the neck, and David Bowie's exposed chest. So with the Kislev flesh base layer put down, I then used a little bit of a dwarf flesh wash in order to add some more pinky tones in there, and then I used an elf flesh in order to add in some of those much lighter kind of peachy highlights on there, just to get some variation to the skin tone to make him start looking a little bit more human. I've now gone in and added the irises. I'm not going to actually add the pupils, those irises will do because they are nice and dark, and I've just used a really dark blue for that, and applied that really carefully using several attempts, I have to admit, using this pin in order to apply those in place because those are absolutely tiny. I'm now very carefully going to take this white and grade it down a bit by putting a tiny little wash of beige over the top of it, and I'm going to be careful that it does not collect too much because that's going to look horrible if there's too much beige, but with just a little bit I should be able to change that white into a much more appropriate, normal, natural colour. It's subtle, but it is effective. That has taken down that whiteness to a much more natural looking colour. A tiny bit of brown wash put into the crevices in the white top there, and then going back over the white and painting in some of the highlights, a little bit of dry brushing, a little bit of just careful painting in order to bring that back up to more of a white colour, and I think that white is now looking acceptable with some shadows in those deeper areas, and it looks like it's about ready. I'm starting to add a few more details now, so I've used some gunmetal and some silver and gold on his pendant here, and I've used this kind of dark blue grey here in order to start adding in that crackle kind of lizard skin appearance on his tights here, which is very subtle, but it does add that extra layer of detail, which I think those tights should definitely have. So I'm going to start adding the bronze highlights onto his cloak here in order to get it more metallic looking, and for this I'm going to use this bronze paint here, and I'm going to dry brush it. So I've got the paint on this brush very lightly, and I'm going to move it across this raised detail. The detail the flowing of the cape is going down the way, those folds, so I'm brushing across the way. And this is going to take a couple of coats in order to build up the kind of colour that I want. But that's already starting to do something, but it's going to need to be much, much brighter colour than this. I'm going to keep going until I build that up a bit more. That is now looking much better with those bronze highlights put on there on the raised parts of the cloak. I now want to go in and put in some of this patina, so I'm going to use some of this matte blue here, this blue tone, and I'm going to mix that with a little bit of this green so that we can get this kind of aged bronze patina on here. And I'm going to add that in, thinned down in a kind of stippled wash kind of thing in order to get that on there. I really don't want a lot, it's got to be very, very light. You can see already that's slightly too much, so I'm going to put a little bit of that on. And once it's on, I'm then going to take another brush, not speak with a paintbrush in my mouth, I'm going to take this other brush and I'm going to kind of thin some of that down just with some thinner, spread that out a bit more. It's already going into the crevices and things there in order to just kind of make sure that's not too bright. And I'm going to go around all of this cloak adding that in. So with that patina applied, that's really, really muted down those bronze highlights, but they still kind of catch the light there. And you can see that there is, you know, that patinaed weathering in there. Once that is applied, it's still slightly tacky, it's not quite dried yet. I then went in with some gold and I've applied that just to the bones, so on here, on the kind of spine, on the kind of rib cage, on the shoulder here, and then the bones on these kind of clasps either side of his head, and that's looking quite nice. I will go in and make some of these a little bit deeper by adding some darker coloration in there, and I might even go back and add a little bit of highlights again, but I like that patina and it's muted everything down nicely. Next up is these boots. While they do appear very dark, they're not quite black. You can see on here it's a kind of very kind of dark brown leathery color, so I'm going to use this, in fact this leather brown, very dark one. I've watered that down a lot and I'm going to apply that over the top of the boots, which at the moment is far too watery and is kind of pooling there, so I'm going to sort that out. I want it to be an uneven color, but I want it to be a bit of a wash, so that you get some darker bits, some lighter bits, but nothing too nasty and uneven. So I'm going to sort that out in just a second, but that's looking a better kind of colour match. And there we go. The boots are still kind of black, but they're now a much dirtier brown leather, kind of muddy looking leather, which is exactly how I think I want it for this. I've now gone ahead and painted in his crystal ball in his hand here, and I've painted that silver. Obviously crystal ball's not really silver, but certainly at this scale that would be horrendous to try and paint a transparent glass ball, I think, so I've just gone for silver. I've also painted in a base layer on his hair here, and for that I've just gone for this kind of brown colour here, and this is going to be the base. I'm then going to use a little bit of this kind of sandy yellow colour to add some highlights, and I'm going to do that by dry brushing them on. Now this is quite a bright colour, so I don't want too many, but this should just bring that up quite nicely and add in some extra highlights make that pop and make it look more three-dimensional there. And with a little bit of this mud brown added into the hair and the eyebrows here, I think that is Jareth pretty much finished. The last thing I want to do is add in the deep shadows in the folds, particularly on the cloak here and on the back here, just to deepen it a little bit more, but particularly on the sparkly cloak and where his legs overlap the cloak. So for that, rather controversially, I'm going to use a straight black colour to paint those in, but then thin out the edges of that so there's no sharp edges, and that should give it some nice much needed depth in there. With those black shadows added into the recessed areas on the cape and round the arm, and with a little bit of light blue added onto the highlights on the cape and then painted over the top again with that metallic blue, just to add that little bit of extra shimmer and lightness and depth, I think he is looking done, apart from the base obviously. So that's up next, and that's just going to get a flat black first of all. With the flat black applied, I'm just going to take this bronze again and I'm going to carefully dry brush that down the way on the base, and I'm going to do that working all the way around in order to add a bit of a metallic colour onto there. And once I've gone all the way around, I'm going to make sure I kind of stipple that into the top so that it gets no brush strokes in there. And some of this, once I've gone round, I might have to touch up a little bit more black in these deep areas in order to tidy that up just a little bit, and that will then be Jareth finished.
The dwarf's about to lead her back to the beginning. She'll soon give up when she realizes she has to start all over again. Well, love.
Well, I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you. Stay tuned for next time when I'll be looking at painting up another one of the miniatures from this board game. Until then, this is Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.